I spent my entire childhood watching my father pour his love and attention into someone who wasn't even his biological child, watching him treat David like the son he had always wanted while I was left on the sidelines, watching from a distance, hoping that one day I would finally be important enough to him. It started small, little things that I tried to ignore, moments that I convinced myself didn't matter, small choices that he made over and over again that eventually built into something undeniable. When David got good grades in school, my father would take him out for a fancy dinner, buy him something expensive, tell everyone how proud he was. But when I brought home straight A's, he barely looked up from whatever he was doing, barely gave me a nod, barely acknowledged that I had accomplished anything at all. When David made the basketball team, my father cleared his schedule, attended every game, cheered the loudest in the stands. But when I got accepted into an advanced placement program, he shrugged and told me that academics were expected, not something to be celebrated. I told myself that it didn't matter, that I didn't need his approval, that I could survive without his validation, but deep down, I wanted what every daughter wants from her father. I wanted to feel like I was enough, like I was worthy of his love, like I wasn't just some obligation he had to tolerate because I had the misfortune of being born first. I thought that maybe, as I got older, things would change, that maybe, eventually, he would see me, that maybe there would be a moment when I would finally matter just as much as David. But that moment never came. By the time I was engaged, I had already come to terms with the fact that I would never be his favorite, that I would never be the first person he thought of, that I would never be the child he was most proud of. But still, somewhere deep inside me, there was a small, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, this would be the moment when he would finally put me first. A wedding was supposed to be one of the most important days of a woman's life, and as much as I had tried to tell myself that it wouldn't hurt if my father wasn't invested, I knew that I still wanted him there, that I still wanted him to walk me down the aisle, that I still wanted to believe that, for once, I would be the priority.
Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
So when I asked him, when I sat across from him at dinner and told him the date of my wedding, when I told him how much it would mean to me if he gave me away, I was bracing myself for some excuse, for some reason why he couldn't help with the planning, for some half-hearted response that would remind me that he had never been the father I needed. But I wasn't prepared for what he actually said, wasn't prepared for the way he set down his fork, barely even looked at me, and said, in the most casual, dismissive tone, "I can't do that, sweetheart. David's wedding is on the same day. His wedding is more important." The words hit me like a punch to the stomach, knocking the air from my lungs, leaving me sitting there in stunned silence, trying to process what I had just heard, trying to understand how he could say something so cruel without even flinching. I stared at him, waiting for some kind of follow-up, waiting for him to realize how much that sentence had shattered me, waiting for him to take it back, to tell me that he had misspoken, that he hadn't meant it the way it sounded. But he didn't. He just picked up his fork again, kept eating like he hadn't just ripped out whatever remaining love I had for him and tossed it aside like it was nothing. I felt my hands shaking under the table, felt the heat rising in my chest, felt the lump in my throat that I refused to let turn into tears. "What do you mean more important?" I finally managed to say, my voice quiet, controlled, trying so hard not to let him see how much it was killing me. My father sighed like he was exhausted, like I was being unreasonable, like I was forcing him to explain something that should have been obvious. "David is my son now," he said simply, with the same tone of voice someone might use when explaining basic math to a child. "He needs me there. I can't be in two places at once, and his wedding, well, it's a bigger deal. A bigger deal." His wedding was a bigger deal than mine. David, the stepchild, the one who hadn't even been in our family until my father remarried, was more important than his own daughter. I don't remember how I got through the rest of that dinner, don't remember how I managed to keep my voice steady, don't remember how I forced myself to nod and smile and pretend that I was fine. I just remember the hollow feeling in my chest, the way my heart felt like it had been ripped open, The way I sat at my own wedding a few months later, watching other brides walk down the aisle with their fathers, and knowing that mine had chosen someone else. I had walked alone, my head held high, refusing to let anyone see how much it hurt, refusing to let anyone see the wound that I knew would never fully heal. And when the vows were said, when the celebration was over, when the guests had gone home and I was left in the quiet aftermath of what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, I made a decision. I was done chasing his approval. I was done begging him to love me. I was done pretending that I was ever going to be enough for him. So I let him go, let him live in the world where David was his real child, let him exist in the reality where I didn't matter, let him bask in the family he had chosen while I built a new life for myself, one that didn't include him. But life has a funny way of coming full circle, of forcing people to face the consequences of the choices they made, of making sure that, one way or another, everyone gets what they deserve. Because years later, when the phone rang, when I heard my father's voice on the other end, when he told me he was sick and needed someone to take care of him, I knew exactly what I was going to say. And this time, he would be the one left behind. The morning of my wedding felt like standing in the eye of a storm, everything around me moving too fast, voices overlapping, laughter filling the space, people bustling around me as they adjusted my dress, fixed my hair, reminded me to breathe, reminded me that today was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. But all I could think about, all I could focus on, all I could feel pressing against my chest like a weight that refused to lift, was the fact that my father wasn't there, wasn't coming, wasn't going to be standing at the end of the hallway to take my arm and walk me toward my future. I had tried not to think about it, had pushed the thought away every time it crept in, had told myself that I didn't care, that it didn't matter, that I was fine, that I didn't need him, that this was just another moment in a long line of disappointments that I should have already been used to. But as the music started playing, as my bridesmaids walked ahead of me, as I stood at the entrance of the aisle with nothing but silence where my father was supposed to be, I felt it. The sting. The emptiness. The quiet kind of hurt that sits deep in your bones, the kind that doesn't come with loud sobs or dramatic breakdowns, but instead lingers like an ache you know will never fully go away. I walked alone, keeping my chin high, keeping my pace steady, feeling every single pair of eyes on me, knowing that some of them were wondering where is her father, knowing that others had already heard the story, already whispered about it in hushed voices, already decided that this was just another tragedy wrapped in wedding day perfection. But I didn't cry, didn't stumble, didn't let my voice waver when I said my vows, because if my father had chosen to miss this moment, if he had decided that David was more important, if he had looked at my wedding day and decided it wasn't worth showing up for, then I wasn't going to let him have even a fraction of my sadness. He didn't call that night, didn't text to ask how it went, didn't check in to see if I had gotten through the day without him. He didn't ask for photos, didn't offer an excuse, didn't even acknowledge the fact that he had chosen someone else's happiness over mine, because in his mind, there was nothing to apologize for, nothing to explain. Nothing wrong with the fact that his daughter had walked down the aisle alone while he stood at David's wedding, smiling, celebrating, toasting to a future that belonged to someone else. The days turned into weeks, the weeks turned into months, the months stretched into years, and with every passing moment, with every birthday that came and went without a phone call, with every family event where I was nothing more than an afterthought, I came to understand a truth that I had been avoiding for far too long. No matter what I did, no matter how successful I became, no matter how much love I had to give, I was never going to be enough for him. I stopped calling, stopped trying, stopped waiting for him to wake up one day and realize that he had a daughter who had been right in front of him all along, a daughter who had spent her whole life trying to earn his love, a daughter who had walked away from her own wedding knowing that she would never be his priority. I stopped checking for his name on my missed calls, stopped hoping for invitations, stopped pretending that maybe, someday, things would change. Because the truth was, things weren't going to change. He had made his choice. And I had finally made mine. I built a life for myself, a life that didn't revolve around waiting for the love he was never going to give, a life where my happiness wasn't tied to whether or not he thought I was worthy of his time. I surrounded myself with people who showed up, with friends who became family, with a husband who held my hand and promised me that I would never feel alone again, with love that wasn't conditional, wasn't measured against someone else's importance, wasn't something I had to beg for. And for a while, I convinced myself that I was free, that I had left it all behind, that I had finally closed the door on the part of my life where I still wanted my father to care. But the thing about life, the thing about karma, the thing about the universe that people like my father never seem to understand, is that it has a way of bringing everything full circle. Because one day, years after he had abandoned me on my wedding day, after he had ignored my existence, after he had treated me like an option while I had spent my whole life treating him like a necessity, the phone rang. And the moment I heard his voice, frail and uncertain, asking for something he had never once given me, I knew. This time, he was the one who was going to be left behind. When the phone rang, I almost didn't answer, almost let it go to voicemail, almost ignored it the way he had ignored me for years, almost let it slip into the void where all his absence had lived, where all his silence had rested, where all his choices had taken root. But something in me needed to hear his voice, needed to know what he wanted, needed to understand what had finally driven him to dial my number after all this time, after all these years of treating me like a distant relative instead of his own daughter. So I answered, my voice steady, my tone neutral, not giving him even the smallest hint of emotion, not giving him the satisfaction of thinking that his call had meant anything more than just another noise interrupting my day. Sophia, he said, his voice weaker than I remembered, not as sharp, not as commanding, not as confident as the man who had once told me that my wedding wasn't important enough for him to attend. It's been a long time, sweetheart. Sweetheart. The word felt foreign coming from him, felt misplaced, felt like a cheap attempt at something that had never been real between us. I couldn't remember the last time he had called me that, couldn't recall a moment in my adult life where he had spoken to me like a daughter he actually cared about, like a child he had once held in his arms and promised to love unconditionally. But now that he needed something, now that he was old and weak and alone, now that David was nowhere to be found, he suddenly wanted to be my father again. I didn't say anything, just let him sit in the silence, let him feel the weight of all the years he had neglected me, let him carry the burden of every missed phone call, every ignored milestone, every moment he had chosen someone else over me. I wanted him to feel it, to hear it in the way I refused to respond, to understand that he no longer had the power to fill the empty spaces he had left inside me, that the time for apologies, for explanations, for excuses had long since passed. He cleared his throat, probably expecting me to say something, probably assuming I would be eager to reconnect, probably hoping that I was still the little girl who had once chased after his love. Still the daughter who had once waited by the phone hoping he would remember to call, still the person who had spent her entire life wanting him to choose her. But I wasn't that girl anymore, and he was about to learn that the hard way. I've been having a hard time lately, he continued, his voice softer now, almost hesitant, almost careful, like he knew he was stepping onto dangerous ground, like he knew he was speaking to someone who had already let him go. I'm not as strong as I used to be, and, well, I need help, sweetheart. I need someone to take care of me. I almost laughed, almost let out a bitter chuckle, almost let the sheer audacity of his words knock the air from my lungs. He needed me now. Now, after everything. Now, after the years of silence. Now, after missing my wedding, after choosing David, after proving over and over again that I was nothing more than an afterthought to him. Now, he wanted me to step up, wanted me to be the daughter he had never been a father to, wanted me to forget all the times he had chosen someone else over me and do the right thing. I still didn't say anything, just let him talk, let him dig himself deeper into the delusion that he still had some kind of claim over me, that I still owed him something, that I was still bound by the invisible chains of family obligation that he had never once extended in my direction. David's got his own life now, he went on, his tone shifting, the first cracks of desperation slipping through the cracks. He's got his job, his family, his responsibilities, and he just doesn't have the time to look after me. But you've always been independent, always been strong. You know how to handle things, and I just thought, well, I thought maybe you could help. I closed my eyes for a moment, absorbing the irony, letting it settle over me like a suffocating weight, letting myself feel the full force of his words, of his expectations, of the twisted logic that had brought him to this moment. David was too busy for him now. David, the son he had chosen, the child he had prioritized, the man he had stood beside on his wedding day while I walked down the aisle alone, had moved on. And now, with nowhere else to turn, with no one else to lean on, with no one else willing to carry the burden of his old age, he had come to me. The daughter he had abandoned. The child he had never prioritized. The woman he had forced to walk through life alone. And now, after all this time, he expected me to be his safety net, his last resort, his only option. I finally spoke, my voice calm, measured, steady, betraying none of the storm raging inside me. You need me now, I said, the words slow, deliberate, designed to make him squirm, designed to make him hear them, really hear them, in a way that he had never heard me before. He let out a shaky breath, like he could sense the shift in power, like he could feel the conversation slipping from his grasp, like he had just begun to realize that I wasn't the little girl he had once ignored. Yes, sweetheart, he said, his voice hopeful, almost relieved, as if my words meant that I was about to say yes, as if he thought I was still capable of forgiving him. As if he believed that family meant something to me the way it had never meant anything to him. I stayed quiet for a long moment, letting him wait, letting him hold on to that hope, letting him believe that he still had control. But deep down, I already knew how this was going to end. The silence stretched between us, heavy and unspoken, filling the space where years of neglect should have been acknowledged, where apologies should have been made, where a real father would have at least tried to make things right before expecting something in return. But Mark had never been the kind of man to dwell on the past, had never been the type to take responsibility for his choices, had never once looked back at the damage he had caused and asked himself if maybe, just maybe, he had been the one in the wrong. And now, after all this time, after all the years of distance, after choosing David over me at every turn, he was sitting there, speaking as if nothing had ever happened, acting as if we had never been anything but close, pretending that the rift between us didn't exist simply because he had never taken the time to acknowledge it. I could hear the false warmth in his voice, the forced familiarity, the desperate attempt to make this conversation feel normal, to erase the history of his absence, to act as if he still held some kind of authority over me. As if his expectations still carried weight, as if the word father was enough to undo all the damage he had done. You know, sweetheart, he said, and the word felt sour, wrong, misplaced coming from him after all these years. Family takes care of family. That's how it's supposed to be. And right now, I need you to be there for me. I almost laughed, almost let out the kind of dry, bitter chuckle that comes when something is so absurd that it barely feels real, almost let the weight of the irony knock the breath from my lungs. Family takes care of family. The words echoed in my mind, repeating over and over, twisting into something dark, something cruel, something that would have been hilarious if it weren't so infuriating. Because Mark had never believed in that, had never lived by those words, had never once extended that philosophy in my direction when I had been the one in need. Family takes care of family unless it's inconvenient. Family takes care of family unless it requires effort. Family takes care of family unless there's someone else more important to take care of first. I kept my expression neutral, kept my voice steady, kept my breathing slow and even, because I wasn't going to let him see how much his words infuriated me, wasn't going to let him see the fire burning just beneath the surface, wasn't going to let him know that he had just given me the exact ammunition I needed to finish this conversation on my own terms. He sighed, as if this entire conversation was exhausting for him, as if I was the one making things difficult, as if I was supposed to just nod along and accept my place in the carefully constructed narrative he had built inside his own mind. I know we haven't always been as close as we should have been, he admitted, and I could tell that even saying those words was an effort for him, like acknowledging even the smallest sliver of truth was a struggle. But that doesn't mean we can't start fresh, right? I mean, what's in the past is in the past, and at the end of the day, we're still family. Family. The word had never felt so meaningless. I could feel his desperation, could hear it in the slight shake in his voice, could see it in the way his words were carefully chosen to manipulate rather than to genuinely repair anything. He wasn't here to apologize, wasn't here to acknowledge what he had done, wasn't here to make amends. He was here because he needed something, and I was his last option. David wasn't answering his calls. His wife was gone. His health was failing. And suddenly, the daughter he had abandoned, the child he had pushed aside over and over again, was the only one left. I tilted my head slightly, studying him, letting him believe that I was actually considering it, letting him sit in the silence, letting him squirm just a little longer. So let me get this straight, I finally said, my tone light, almost casual, like I was talking about the weather instead of the years of neglect between us. You spent my entire life making sure I knew exactly where I stood with you. You missed my wedding, you chose David over me, you ignored every major moment of my life, and now that you need help, you're just expecting me to step up. His expression faltered, just for a second, just long enough for me to see the flicker of discomfort cross his face, just long enough for me to know that he had not been expecting me to say that, just long enough for me to feel the first thrill of satisfaction coil in my chest. But then, just as quickly, he covered it up, plastered on a strained smile, leaned forward slightly as if his sheer presence was supposed to soften me somehow. Sophia, he said, his voice still filled with that fake, forced warmth. I never meant to hurt you. You know that, right? You were always important to me. I let out a slow breath, shaking my head just slightly, just enough for him to see that I wasn't falling for any of it, that I wasn't the same person I had been back then. That whatever little control he thought he had over me had disappeared the day he told me that my wedding wasn't important enough for him to attend. You keep saying family takes care of family like it means something, I said, my voice still level, still controlled, still giving away nothing of what was coming next. But when did you ever take care of me? When did you ever put me first? When did you ever act like I was anything more than an afterthought? He blinked, opened his mouth, closed it again, struggled for words that weren't there, because there was no answer that would save him from the truth. I let this silence stretch again, let it grow heavier, let him feel exactly what I had felt all these years, let him sit in the discomfort of knowing that the daughter he had ignored now held all the power. I could tell he was about to try again, could see the gears turning in his head, could see the desperation starting to leak through his carefully crafted exterior. But it was too late. Because I already knew exactly how this was going to end. I let this silence stretch just a little longer, let him sit in the weight of his own words, let him feel the full force of what he had done without giving him the escape of immediate forgiveness, without handing him the easy way out, without letting him believe that a few carefully chosen words would be enough to erase years of neglect. He shifted in his seat, his hands twitching slightly like he wanted to reach for something, maybe a drink, maybe a distraction. Maybe some kind of anchor to keep himself steady now that he was realizing I wasn't falling into the role of the obedient daughter he had expected me to be. I took a slow breath, deliberately measured, letting him think for just a moment longer that he might still have a chance to twist this in his favor, that I might actually be considering stepping into the role of caregiver, that I might be willing to forget, to forgive, to pretend that history hadn't played out exactly the way it had. And then, finally, I spoke, my voice steady, controlled, carrying the kind of quiet force that I knew would cut deeper than anything I could ever scream. You know, I said, tilting my head slightly as if I was just remembering something, as if this wasn't a moment I had relived over and over again, as if this wasn't a wound that had never quite healed. This reminds me of a conversation we had once. His eyes flickered, confusion settling in, his mouth opening just slightly before closing again, like he was trying to place whatever moment I was talking about, like he was scrambling to keep up, like he knew something was coming but wasn't sure what. A long time ago, I continued, still keeping my voice light, still keeping my tone deceptively casual, still watching him with the kind of gaze that made sure he felt every single word. I asked you for something. I asked you for one day, just one, and you told me you couldn't. Do you remember? His lips parted, his throat bobbed, his shoulders tensed ever so slightly, but he still didn't speak, still didn't interrupt, still didn't realize that there was nothing he could say that would change the outcome of this conversation. I do, I said before he could even think of denying it, before he could even pretend that his memory was too foggy to recall, before he could lie his way out of the moment I was dragging back into the light. I remember it like it was yesterday. I remember sitting across from you, asking you to walk me down the aisle, asking for something that every father should want to do for his daughter. I remember thinking that maybe, just maybe, you would finally put me first. His expression shifted, something like discomfort creeping across his features, something like understanding flickering in his eyes, something like regret curling at the edges of his lips. And I remember exactly what you said to me. I went on, my voice still smooth, still deliberate, still sharp enough to cut through the air like a blade pressing against his skin. You said David's wedding was more important. You said you couldn't be in two places at once. You said I would understand. He swallowed hard, his fingers tightening against his knee, his entire body coiling like he was bracing for something, like he was realizing, truly realizing, that this wasn't a conversation about helping him. I leaned forward slightly, just enough to make sure he felt every inch of the space between us, just enough to make sure he knew that whatever power he had once held over me was long gone. Well, I said, and this time, I let the coldness seep into my tone, let the years of hurt sharpen the edges of my words, let him hear the finality in my voice before I even delivered the final blow. Now I can't be in two places at once. His breath hitched, his face paled, his fingers twitched again like he wanted to reach for me, like he wanted to take the words back, like he was trying to come up with some excuse, some justification, some pathetic attempt to rewrite history into something more convenient. Sophia, he started, his voice weaker now, cracking around the edges, the confidence he had carried at the beginning of this conversation completely gone. That's not the same. I raised an eyebrow, tilting my head like I was considering it, like I was giving his words even the smallest bit of weight. Isn't it? I asked, letting the question linger, letting him choke on it, letting him feel the weight of his own hypocrisy pressing down on him. His mouth opened and closed, his shoulders sagging, his body shrinking in on itself as the realization fully settled, as the truth of his own words finally wrapped around him like a noose he had tied himself. You made your choice, I continued, my voice softer now, but not kinder, never kinder, just quieter, just more devastating in the way it left no room for argument. You told me, on one of the most important days of my life, that someone else mattered more. And now, all these years later, I'm telling you the exact same thing. His lips trembled, his breath came out uneven, his hands clenched into weak fists against his lap. Sophia, please, he tried again, the desperation leaking into his voice, the panic settling into his eyes, the fear clawing at his expression. I didn't know, you didn't think I'd remember? I cut in smoothly, watching as he flinched, as his entire body recoiled, as his shoulders stiffened like I had physically struck him. You didn't think the daughter you abandoned would one day be the only person left? He didn't answer, didn't move, didn't breathe for a moment, his entire face a mask of disbelief, of regret, of something that was far too little, far too late. I have my own life now, I said, pushing myself up from my seat, brushing invisible dust from my hands, feeling the final pieces of the past crumbling into nothing beneath my feet. And just like your life was too busy for me back then, mine is too busy for you now. His head shook, his mouth opened, but I was already turning, already walking toward the door, already leaving him behind the way he had left me all those years ago. Sophia, he called after me, his voice breaking, his hands gripping the arms of the chair like he wanted to stand, like he wanted to stop me, like he wanted to rewrite history now that he was finally feeling the pain of being unwanted. But I didn't stop. I didn't turn around. I didn't say another word. And this time, he was the one left standing alone. I walked out of that house without looking back, without hesitating, without feeling even the smallest flicker of doubt, without questioning whether I was making a mistake, without allowing myself to second-guess the decision I had been waiting to make for years. The door closed behind me with a quiet finality, with the soft, almost insignificant sound of a moment that had been decades in the making, with the weight of a history that had finally reached its inevitable end. I stood outside for a moment, breathing in the cool air, feeling the tension slowly unravel from my chest, truly realizing, that for the first time in my life, I didn't care what my father thought of me. He was alone now, just as he had left me alone all those years ago, just as he had forced me to walk down that aisle without him, just as he had made me sit through a childhood filled with quiet disappointment, just as he had spent years proving that I had never been his priority. He had made his choices, had written the story exactly the way he wanted, had decided who mattered and who didn't, had looked at the life he was given and determined that I was not important enough to be part of it. And now, when the world had stripped away every person he had once put before me, he finally understood what it felt like to be unwanted. I told myself that was enough. I told myself that justice had been served. I told myself that I was free. But as I drove away, as the house grew smaller in my rearview mirror, as the silence settled in around me, the doubts started creeping in, whispering in the corners of my mind, asking the question I didn't want to answer. Had I gone too far? Was I cruel for leaving him like that, for refusing to offer even the smallest bit of kindness, for watching him break under the weight of his own regret and doing absolutely nothing to stop it? Had I become just as heartless as he had been? Had I let the years of resentment twist me into someone incapable of compassion? Had I taken things one step too far simply because I could? The phone calls started almost immediately. Some people in the family had already heard, already knew what had happened, already decided which side they were on, already prepared their judgments, already lined up their opinions like they had the right to speak on something they had never experienced themselves. "Your father made mistakes," one of my aunts said, her voice sharp with disapproval, with the unwavering belief that forgiveness was the only acceptable path, that I was supposed to be the bigger person. That I was supposed to erase the past simply because it was easier than holding someone accountable. "But he's old now, Sophia. He needs you. Do you really want to live with the guilt of turning your back on him?" But I didn't feel guilty. Not even a little. Not even in the way I thought I might. Because if he had truly needed me, if he had truly wanted me in his life, if he had truly seen me as his daughter, he wouldn't have waited until he had no other options to say my name. Other calls came from people who had always understood, from family members who had seen the way I had been treated, from voices that carried the weight of reassurance instead of judgment. "You did the right thing," my cousin told me, her voice steady, certain, unwavering in a way that made me feel, for the first time, that maybe I didn't even need the validation at all. Not everyone deserves forgiveness. Not every wound needs to be healed. Some people have to live with what they've done. I let those words settle, let them press against the guilt that hadn't even fully formed, let them act as a shield against the opinions of those who had never once stepped into my shoes, never once known what it was like to be the afterthought in your own father's life. And in that moment, I realized something else, something far more important than whether or not I had been too cruel, something that mattered more than the opinions of people who hadn't lived my life, something that gave me more peace than I had ever expected to find. I didn't need anyone's approval. Not anymore. Not from my father. Not from the family members who thought I owed him something simply because we shared DNA. Not from the voices that tried to tell me that doing the right thing always meant being the forgiving one. I had spent my entire life waiting for my father to see me, waiting for him to acknowledge me, waiting for him to give me the love I had so desperately wanted from him. But I wasn't that little girl anymore. I wasn't waiting by the phone, hoping he would call. I wasn't searching for his approval in the empty spaces he had left behind. I wasn't longing for a father who had never been mine to begin with. And maybe that was real justice. Maybe that was the revenge I hadn't even realized I wanted. Not in watching him suffer. Not in seeing the regret on his face. Not in walking away when he needed me the most. But in knowing, truly knowing, that I didn't need him anymore. That I had never needed him. That I had built a life without him. that I was happy without him. And as I sat there, letting the weight of everything settle, letting the noise of the outside world fade into nothing, letting myself breathe in the reality of what I had done, I asked myself the only question that still mattered. Would you have done the same?